Good morning. I'm John Page from Dymocks, and welcome to today's Chapter 1 event. Our very special guest today is Kathy Reichs. Kathy Reichs is a professor of anthropology in addition to being a best-selling author. As a forensic anthropologist, Kathy Reichs has brought her own dramatic work experience to her mesmerising forensic thrillers. She is best known for her Temperance Brennan novels that inspired the hit television series Bones. She's our very special guest today to talk about the latest Bones book, A Conspiracy of Bones. Sorry about that. Kathy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Each book in the Bones series is inspired by a real case that you've worked on. What was the inspiration behind the latest book?
Well, the idea for the faceless corpse, and the story opens with the discovery of a faceless corpse, came from a case I did several years back, don't ask me how many, in Ottawa, outside of Ottawa, Canada. A journalist disappeared and was found, her body was found several months later in a very wooded area, very remote area, and it had been scavenged by bears. Bears. And so I took the idea of a body badly scavenged beyond recognition and moved it to North Carolina, and therefore I had to change the species of scavenger, so it became feral hogs. So the story starts out with the discovery of a faceless corpse. There's no face, no teeth, no hands, so you can't do dental identification, you can't do fingerprints, you can't do visual. So it's a typical forensic anthropology case.
And it's been 4 years since the last Temperance Brennan novel. Why the break, and what drew you back to the character?
Well, I was never finished with the character. During the break, I did an off-series standalone. I did a book called Two Nights, where I created a new character called Sunday Night, and that was fun. I also worked on a collection of short stories called the Bone Collection. So that was released during that time period as well. And in that, I created a situation which I then used in A Conspiracy of Bones. There's a story in the Bone Collection called First Bones, and it's an origin story. And it's my origin story, how I got into forensic anthropology. And it's also Temperance Brennan's origin story. So in that story, we learned that her forever longtime boss, Tim Larrabee, in the Charlotte Mecklenburg Medical Examiner office has been murdered. So when Conspiracy of Bones opens, there's a new boss in town. And this Tempe and this woman, Dr. Margot Hevner, have history. They do not get along, and Hevner has sworn that she has exiled Tempe from the medical examiner's office. She has sworn Tempe will never work on a case there again.
And this is the 19th book now in the series. What are the challenges of writing such a long-running series, and what do you enjoy about it?
Well, I think one of the challenges is that you have used the same core cast of characters 18 times before this book. So this may be the first Temperance Brennan book that anyone picks up. So you've got to introduce your characters, but it may be the 19th book that a reader is picking up. So you've got to introduce the characters, but you've got to do it in a way that's not going to bore your returning readers. You've got to introduce the premise of a forensic anthropologist. This is the kind of work she does, the kind of cases she does, without boring your returning writers, while at the same time informing your first time readers. That's one of the difficulties. What's fun is that I really do enjoy this character. And in each of the books, for a continuing character, I think, to be successful, readers have to care about what that character is doing. So that character has to keep evolving. And in each book, you have to reveal something new and different about the character. So they're getting to know the character better and better with each book. And she has to evolve, and her relationships have to evolve, I think. So that's one of the fun parts and also one of the hard parts.
Excellent. And what is your process for writing one of your books? Does the science come first and then you write the story around it, or does the story come first and then you try and fit the science in?
It really kind of evolves together. I begin thinking about the next book. Right now I'm writing book number 20, but I'm already thinking about, what story might be in book 21. And if that's the story, what's the crime? And then what science am I going to use to solve the crime? So I'm always looking for something down the road that what's going to be of interest to people 2 years from now, because it's a year to write the book at least, and then another year in production. So what are people going to be thinking about and worrying about 2 years from now? So that's kind of how I pick what the crime might be. I just don't want to do serial killer after serial killer. I do like to have a little bit more substance in there. And then how can I solve that? How can I drive? Because I write murder mysteries, but the difference is the solution is driven by science. So I don't want to do bones book after book after book. That would be boring. So I do try to use a different kind of science in each story.
And have you been inspired by world events of the last few months, but with the coronavirus and the pandemic, has that kind of planted any seeds?
Well, interestingly, I started the next book, which is called The Bone Code. More than 6 or 8 months ago, I started it. I'm moving towards finishing it. And it has to do with genome editing, human genome editing, and an outbreak of not a pandemic. It's not a contagious disease, but just these inexplicable spikes in genetically based susceptibility to a certain disease. So it's quite coincidental that this came along as I'm in the middle of writing about that.
You're no longer working full-time as a forensic anthropologist. How do you stay up to date with all the technological advances in the field?
I still attend our annual meeting. Our main professional organization is the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, so I still attend our annual meeting. And it is made up of 9 sections, 10 sections. I always lose count. But forensic dentistry, forensic pathology, forensic biologists are there, the toxicologists, the fire and arson people, everybody is there. So by attending the meetings and going to different sections, I don't just go to the anthropology sections and listen to the scientific presentations. I bounce around to all the different sections. So I keep up that way. I also, our main professional journal is the Journal of Forensic Sciences. So I regularly read, every edition when that comes out, I read. And then I'm in constant contact with colleagues and, hear what they're doing and hear about the cases they've been working on. So even though I'm not doing casework, I'm very actively involved in staying up to date with what's going on.
As well as being an enduring book series, Bones was also a long-running television series. What was it like to see your characters being translated to the small screen, and how did you balance writing new novels with the storylines they were exploring on the TV show?
Yeah, I'm not one of these authors that's going to whine about, you took my work and you destroyed it. I had the best experience. We had a fantastic group of writers and producers and crew and on-camera talent. Emily Deschanel is the most wonderful, kind, gentle, generous person you could ever imagine. So from the beginning, I agreed to option my character to Hart Hansen and Barry Josephson, the executive producers, because we were on the same page about what we wanted to see in the television series. I had other offers and they just weren't, I didn't get the right vibe. But with Hart and Barry, it just felt right. We both wanted a strong female character as the lead character. We wanted humor. We wanted to put humor in the show, as I do in the books. And that's hard when you're dealing with violent death every episode or every book. I mean, that is a very delicate tightrope you have to walk without being offensive. They actually coined a term for us. They called us the first crimedy that was on television. So I had a great experience. Second part of your question, I think of TV Tempe and book Tempe because the character is not the same and the setting is not the same. The TV show, she's working in Washington, D.C. She's at the Jeffersonian Institution. She's younger than she is in the books. So there, she works with an FBI agent named Celie Booth, whereas in the books she works either with Skinny Slidell. such as in A Conspiracy of Bones, or she's working with Andrew Ryan. So they're different. So when I sit down to write a novel, I'm not impacted by what TV Tempe is doing. I'm writing book Tempe. And I think at first there was a little bit of resistance to that, to the fact that it was different. And I would suggest to people, well, think of Bones as kind of a prequel. It's a younger, less polished, less sophisticated Tempe. And I think people were good with that. Obviously, we were on there for 12 years. So we're the longest running scripted drama in the history of Fox. So we're pretty proud of that.
Wow. What inspired you to become a writer?
Well, as an academic, I was always a writer. Probably what inspired me to write fiction.
Right.
Publish or perish, right? Well, I made full professor in the mid-90s, and so I had the freedom to do whatever I wanted, basically. And I didn't want to do another textbook or another journal article. I had also just worked on a serial murder case in Montreal, which had some very interesting elements of dismemberment. And there's a point in that first book, Deja Dead, in which Tempe lectures Andrew Ryan about how many different kinds of saws there are and how these saws can leave evidence in the bones as to what kind of tool was used. Anyway, so I had the freedom to try something new. And I had a story idea. So that came together, and I just thought it would be fun to write fiction. I also thought it would maybe be a way to bring my science to a broader audience, because I think back in the early 90s into the mid 90s, no one ever heard of us. We worked away in our labs, forensic scientists, nobody ever heard of us. And then right about that time, people got the itch to learn about or read about or watch forensic. We get CSI and we get Bones and so all of a sudden forensic science became very popular. So that all kind of came together in the mid 90s, and I decided, well, I'm gonna try my hand at fiction. I had no idea what I was doing other than trying to write the kind of book I like to read. That was my guide.
You touched on the kind of the popularity of forensic science and how that's kind of exploded in the last 20 years. What have been some of the perils that you've seen of how that kind of fascination we've all had now for forensic science in criminology? What are some of the perils that kind of popularity has had?
Well, I think everyone almost feels obligated now to put in the autopsy scene or to put in, the forensic scientists, even though it may not be a major element in their story. And often they get it wrong. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a peril. I think it's also that we hear about the CSI effect, that jurors, for example, expect DNA on every single, it's a fender bender or a minor burglary or something that expect DNA testing. Well, that's not realistic. It's not going to happen. And also, I think people have high expectations that every single crime is going to be solved, because that's what happens on television. That's what happens in forensic science-driven books, and that's not realistic either, that every crime does not get solved. So I think it's good. It's raising the public's awareness of forensic science and the power of, it's a powerful tool, DNA or blood spatter pattern analysis, or, whatever you happen to be looking at. So it's good that they're learning about that, but expectations are a little higher, I think, because of forensic science fiction.
And what books and authors influence you as a crime writer?
Oh, I tend to like the darker stuff, the grittier stuff. I like, like Michael Connelly. I like Karen Slaughter, Lisa Gardner. I'm much more drawn to that than I am to just, tea cozy type of intellectual mysteries.
Excellent. Now, so this is the point where we can throw open the questions to those that are watching from home. So if you have questions, type them in there, and we'll put them up on the screen, and Kathy can answer your questions. We'll see if burning questions ready to go. Here's our first one from Katie Mayer. Can you tell us about how Temperance has changed since Deja Dead?
Oh, well, she's let me think about that. She doesn't go out and do some of the wild, crazy things she did in the early books. She took a lot of risks, and Deja Dead, I think she went out and dug up a body on her own or something. Right? She's not doing that. She is still more involved in the investigative end of it than I ever was. I would work with the investigating officer, but I never went out, doing door-to-door police legwork with a homicide detective. I would go to a crime scene to collect the human remains and then work on them in my lab. But I think she does a lot less of that just taking off on her own than she did in the early books.
Excellent. We'll see if here's another one from Sue. My teenage son loves your viral novels. Will you write more YA?
Here's the thing. I wrote the Virals books with my son, Brendan, who was a lawyer. And I think he had practiced law for 2 years, hated it, was thinking of anything to get out of having to be a lawyer. So he came to me and said, why don't we do a young adult series? So I thought, yeah, that's a great idea. We both thought that would be a way to bring our science to, there seemed to be a lot of young people interested in forensics. And I would have parents come to my signings, my events, and they'd say, is it okay if my daughter reads your books? And I'd say, well, how old is your daughter? And they'd say, well, she's 7. I'd say, no, it's really not. So we thought it would be a good idea to write about forensic science at the kind of middle school to high school level. And so we created Tori Brennan, who's Temperance Brennan's 14-year-old great niece. And she and her 3 best friends, who are boys, use forensic science at that level to solve cold cases and resolve problems and issues. So we did 6 books together, and that went very well. And then he dumped me. He signed a contract. He did his own series called Nemesis, Genesis, and Crystallis. He's now doing a middle grade series called The Dark Deep. So he's gone off on his own as a young adult writer. So there you go. I don't think we'll do any more. But, well, never say never, but maybe, who knows?
What was the process like, writing for a younger audience, and how did that kind of change your style? And then writing with your son, like, was there any issues? Did you have any differences of opinion?
Oh, yeah. And he's a litigator, so he's really good at arguing his case. He's better at some things. He was much better at writing. Okay, first part, the way the books differ is the dialogue is different for kids. 14-year-old kids, 15, 16, don't talk the way crusty old homicide detectives talk. And social concerns, the things that they're worried about in their day-to-day social life. So that's different. As far as the storyline, the Viral series is equally as complicated and complex. In fact, the Virals books are big, thick, honking books. They're thicker than most Temperance Brennan books. So the storylines are just as layered and nuanced and complicated. It's just that they're, as I said, their social concerns and the way they talk is different. And he was good at that. He was good at having a pulse on that. And I was good at the science and constructing the storylines. So we would separate out, I forget exactly how we did it. And then periodically print it out, and I would go through it and edit it, and literally with a red pen, and then I would give that to him, and he would. Then we would have our editorial meetings and discuss our artistic differences. He swore I was destroying his art, but we would. We would work it out, and we would reach a compromise, or he would do it my way, or I would see his point on some things.
Would you do it again with another author, or are you more happy writing your books by yourself?
Well, I would do it again. I also wrote a short story with Lee Child. It's in a book which is the International Thriller Writers does not charge members dues. And the way we make money for the organization is that we put together anthologies. So Lee and I wrote a short story in an anthology called Matchup. And the premise was to put a male author and protagonist together with a female author and protagonist. So everybody scrambled around. It was like the prom, trying to see who you could together with. So Lee and I did, and it was really a great experience. I had the best time doing that. And it was so easy. We just did it by computer distance. Lee was on his end. He did the Reacher parts and I'm on my end, and I did the Temperance Brennan parts. And then I think he did a final edit, and then I did a final edit, and it was painless, absolutely painless. So I would do it again. Yes.
Fantastic. What a great crossover. Oh, now I've got a question from Susan. Can you tell us how you have evolved from writing the first book?
Well, when I go back every now and then, I'll have to go back and check a fact, you know, what color were Brennan's sister's eyes or something, you know, and I want to keep it consistent. And 19 books down the road, you don't always remember, or how old was somebody or whatever. Anyway, so I'll go back, and when I do go back to the early books like Deja Dead, I used an awful lot of metaphors and similes. He was as fat as this, or he was as smart as I would, and I did. As I progressed, I did a lot less of that. I mean, that's one example of something I changed in the books. And then, of course, I also had her doing less of this risky business, going off on her own.
All right, now we've got a question from Beverly. How did you approach plotting and structure?
How do I approach, sorry?
Plotting and structure.
Plotting and structure. Yeah, we talk about plotters and pantsers among writers. Plotters are people who plot everything out. You know, and my son Brendan is a plotter. He has a big whiteboard, and he has color-coded cards, and he breaks down his main story, his secondary story, his third level story, every single character, chapter by chapter, card by card. I don't do that. That's a plotter. A pantser is someone who goes by the seat of their pants. So I'm kind of a hybrid between those. I do some outlining. I outline probably the first 6 to 8, maybe 10 chapters. And then I know what the end will be. I know what the climax scene will be. But then I just sit down and I write it. I do it. Now I do an outline, a postmortem outline. As I finish a chapter, I add it to the outline. So by the time I finish the book, I have a complete outline of the book. And that way I know what's going on at what point in the story. And if I've covered everything in the story, I can go back through the outline to know where I need to go to explain a false clue or whatever it is I need to do.
So reverse plotting almost.
Now, that's not to say it's not a feedback loop, because as I'm writing and maybe researching something, I'll stumble on something and I think, that's great, I'm going to use that. So then I go back and I introduce it, which means I have to go back earlier and make some changes to make it make sense as well. So it is feedback. It's not strictly linear. I'm a linear writer. I write chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4. My daughter's a writer. And if she's in a happy mood, she writes the love scene. And if she's in a glum mood, she writes the death scene. I can't do that. I do chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in order.
Now I've got a question from Luke. How accurate is the TV series? Do they try to be as accurate as possible, or do they take a few liberties?
Both. We in the writer's room, and I wrote several episodes of the show. And you do what's called breaking the story. You go into the writer's room and together you throw out ideas when you're just brainstorming an episode. And our rule of thumb was plausible. Is it plausible? We would not just make something up. We would not just introduce a technology or a technique that didn't really exist. Now, what are the odds that any forensic lab would actually have that piece of equipment? You know, they might be very, very low, but it exists. So we tried to keep it plausible.
And does that apply the same with your books as well? Or are you a little bit more stricter with yourself?
A little bit stricter, I think. We took a few more liberties for the magic of television, but like that lab, the forensic platform lab in the Jeffersonian, have I ever seen a lab like that? No, but everything on there exists. All of those props and pieces of equipment came from, you know, medical supply houses and biological supply houses. So.
Excellent. Well, now I've got another question from Emily. What would you recommend for young adults who are about to finish school, contemplating entering the forensic science field?
Going to university, I assume you mean. Going to university, I would recommend. And I would not major in forensic science, because, you know, one of these broad programs that teaches you a little bit of this and a little bit, you're going to learn about forensic science, but you're not going to acquire a skill that'll be saleable in a forensics lab. You need to take chemistry or biological anthropology or physics or molecular biology. You need to learn something that's going to make you useful, not just learn about the field of forensic science in general. That would be my advice.
And we've got a question here from Simon. You mentioned DNA is not used for simple crimes. How long does it take for DNA to be used? And is there a good database for DNA matching similar to fingerprints?
There are DNA databases in the US. Well, okay, this is a complicated question now because we've gotten into this new, it's a complicated question for many reasons. There are many DNA databases. We tend to use something called CODIS, the Combined DNA Identification System in the US. And most countries have that similar thing. And it's primarily people whose DNA, who have been arrested or whatever your laws are, arrested and convicted or whatever. So there are those databases. There is also a new field of forensic genetic genealogy, in which completely different DNA databases are used, and a completely different kind of DNA data, SNP versus STR genome is used. So there are those DNA databases also. There's also a section in this book in which Tempe kind of lectures Skinny Slidell about the fact that for years she's told him DNA is only useful for comparison. You've got to have a possible, you've got to have a name, so you can go get John Doe's a sample from his family or a sample from his toothbrush or whatever, and then you can compare it and see if it's a match. Well, DNA has now moved beyond that to where it's predictive, and you can use DNA from a crime scene or a victim to predict what the perpetrator who left that DNA behind looks like, what color their skin is, what color their hair is, what color their eyes are, what geographic area their ancestors might have come from. So that's a whole new expansion of the power of DNA as well. That was a very long, rambling answer. I don't know if that.
No, that was great. That was fascinating. I didn't know that the DNA could do that predictive stuff now either, so that's great. I've also got a question here from Paige. Has there been more interest in women studying forensic anthropology because of Tempe?
I can't claim credit that it's because of Tempe, but there has been, colleagues tell me who are at universities, there's been an explosion of interest in studying forensic anthropology, and universities that didn't used to have programs in forensic anthropology and other areas have added them, and that they have huge enrollments of students in those. What the demographics are, if there are more females than males, you know what, I'd hesitate to say yes, because I don't know the actual breakdown of that. I do know that in the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, in the anthropology section, there is an enormous number of young female members now, student members.
Excellent. So we've got a question from Beverly again. So on television, DNA results, predictive or comparative, come back in hours. What is the latest turnaround time in real life?
Well, they don't come back in hours on our show. We made a point not to ever do that. It isn't that it takes that long to turn the DNA around. It's that you're in the queue and you got to wait your turn. And that can take a very, very long time because the lines can be very, very long, unless it's a really high profile case and you can get yourself bumped to the front, which Tempe always manages to do in the books. You're going to have a wait, but the actual turnaround on the DNA is not that long.
Excellent. We'll see if this, and Susan's got a question again. So do you have any advice for new authors? I'm currently writing my own crime novel.
I don't know what level you're at, but I would certainly get an agent when you're ready to submit it. If you're, because I have heard a number of people in different publishing houses say they don't even look at unagented submissions. So it should come from an agent. If you want to be published with a traditional house, people are self-publishing on the internet or through Amazon or whatever also. So there's also those avenues that weren't available when I started out in publishing. And if you're earlier than that, if you're still working on your book, then I would suggest you get into a writer's group so that you can critique each other, read each other's work, and and get support from others who are trying to do the same thing that you're trying to do.
Excellent. And we've got time for one last question. So if you've been holding back, get that there now. This is the last one for Kathy. So here's Karen. So as a writer, what keeps you motivated?
Oh, well, I have a contract. So I have a date on my contract. I'm a sucker for that. So that does keep me motivated. Also, though, when I'm away from it for a while, I'm building a new house. I'm talking to you from my beach house on one of the barrier islands off Charleston, South Carolina. And I've sold this house and I'm building a new, close to completion on a new one right down the beach from this one. And this week I've had to be engaged in double checking, I don't know, carpentry trim and plumbing fixtures. And I really haven't been able to write for almost a week and I miss it. So it's a motivator to me that I really do like to write and I miss it when I'm not able to do it.
Excellent. Well, we'll let you go back and get back to the next Temperance Brennan novel. So thank you so much for joining us today, Kathy. It was fascinating. Everyone, the Conspiracy Bones is out now. It's available at all Dymocks stores. So if you haven't read the latest one, go in and grab it today. Thank you again, and we look forward to more books down the track as you get going.
And I'm looking forward to being able to tour in Australia. We were all set with the tour, and then this virus came along. So hopefully next year.
Fantastic. Hopefully we can meet in person.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And thank you for everyone for tuning in today.
Bye-bye.